Okay, so I'm sure that if you're as excited for Spider-Man No Way Home as much as I am, you may have very well also likely heard about all the leaks and rumors going around that Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield might possibly, very likely, be appearing as their respective Spider-Man in No Way Home alongside Tom Holland in a similar fashion to Into the Spider-Verse, except, instead of just different versions of a Spider-Man or a Spider-Woman fighting against villains from the main universe that brought them there in the first place, it's 3 different adaptation versions of Spider-Man having rematches against returning villains from their universes. And with the recent new trailer, the possibility of that happening does seem pretty likely now. There are lines that actually hint to other Spider-Men. There are a few moments in the trailer that actually look like other Spideys may have very well been edited out, Endgame style. Some parts of the trailer also match up with some of the leaks that got out a few months ago. And also, let's not ignore the fact that, aside from Electro, all the villains in this movie look pretty much exactly the same as we saw them in their previous films. Lizard looks kind of the same, although it's hard to tell from a distance. Sandman also looks the same. Doc Ock looks exactly the same. And Gabi looks 100% the same as he did in the original movie. Like, why would you bring back all these villains, bring back all of their same actors, make them look almost all the same as they did previously, and not also bring back their spiders? If the villains can come in from the multiverse, why not also the heroes? So in the case that they do actually show up, which at this point, mostly for Tobey, I hope is true, I decided to make this video giving my personal ranking of Tobey's, Andrew's, and Tom's respective Spidey movies, where I'll give short little reviews in order from worst to best. Yes, I know I already did do reviews for Tom's first 2 Spider-Man movies, but I figured I'd just do a little re-reviews for them since No Way Home is the one that will establish Tom Holland as the second Spider-Man to get a full trilogy, so yeah, it just makes sense to retrospectively re-review them before this. So sit back and enjoy. This is my personal ranking of the Spider-Man movies. The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Now look, I know for a fact that there are indeed a lot of fans out there that do actually like this movie. A little bit more than you'd realize. And look, I'm fine with that. Look, if you like The Amazing Spider-Man 2, that's entirely fine. More power to you. But if you ask me, I personally agree with the other common opinion that The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is easily the worst, most trashly written Spider-Man movie ever made. Like, the film mostly just consists of a lot of filler involving sequel and spin-off bait, and Peter going on this incredibly irrelevant mission to discover the big secrets about his mom and dad that goes nowhere, and pretty much all it does is ruin the whole uniqueness factor about Spider-Man's origins. Like, why would they make it so that Peter was, like, destined to become Spider-Man? That spider bite could have happened to anybody. And even when not focusing on any of that stuff, the movie is still a fucking disaster. I always hear that Peter and Gwen Stacy's romance in this entire duology is like the single best Spider-Man movie romance, and they say that because of the fact that Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone were a couple IRL during these movies. And while I kinda agree with that a little bit in terms of the first movie, not that it's the best romance, but like, yeah, the chemistry works. But I don't really agree with that in the case of this film. Like, it begins with them being a couple again because he's going against what he literally promised Captain Stacy as he died in the first movie. And then they break up again when he realizes that after seeing his ghost. And then the next time they meet, they're all over each other again. And then after the Electro fight, they have an argument which Peter doesn't win. And then the next time they meet, they're back to kissing and fondling each other. Like, it happens a lot in this movie, and it gets super annoying. Why even have them break up in the beginning if it leads to nothing? Not to mention, why doesn't Gwen seem to have any problem with Peter just admitting that he's been stalking her ever since the breakup? If I had a girlfriend and at one point we broke up and she admits to me at some point that she has been following me around since then, I'd be a little freaked out. Like, that's creepy. Don't do that. The villains in this movie are also terrible. Like, you have Electro, played by Jamie Foxx, who starts off as an Oscorp engineer that just randomly happens to become a Spider-Man fanatic after Spider-Man saved him in the Rhino chase in the beginning. And then after he goes through the incident that gives him his powers, he soon after that decides that he wants Spider-Man dead because as he's causing a ruckus in Times Square, all the screens in town start showing Spider-Man instead of him. Like, what? I don't get it. It never makes any sense to me. Like, I thought you were establishing Max as a guy who wants friends in his life, not just to be a television star. But to be fair, in regards to Electro, he's nowhere near as bad as this film's Green Goblin was. Not only because of Dane DeHaan's god-awful performance and how atrocious the design is, but because he has no good reason to even be in the movie at all. Literally his only purpose in this entire film was to kill Gwen Stacy off like he did in the comics, which was also incredibly pointless. They establish him as an apparent childhood friend of Peter, even though that was never at all previously established in the first film. Like, do you really expect me to believe that Peter never knew anything about Oscorp, yet he knew a kid who was the son of the guy who started Oscorp? Like, what the fuck? And they try to give him a more sad and tragic origin, where he progressively gets more and more deranged as he tries to find spider blood to cure this disease he has. But it never once comes off as dark or sad at all. In fact, a few times, it's actually pretty unintentionally funny. And when he does finally become the Green Goblin and show up for the final fight, it's after Electro is killed, and at like the final 10 minutes of the movie, where he attacks Gwen, has her fall to her death, has a little tussle with Pete, and then he gets knocked out in less than 3 minutes. Like, really? You guys are gonna do Gobby dirty like that? The Green Goblin is literally the arch nemesis of Spider-Man, and you're gonna treat him like a second fiddle? Why? Come on, if you have no good reason for him to be in the movie and you're not even going to do much with him, don't put him in the fucking movie. How is that so impossible for you guys to understand? And I'm not even going to bother complaining about the Rhino that much because he's just forgettable as fuck. Like, he's just in like 2 scenes, yet they marketed him as if he was one of the main foes. So like, whatever. Now, don't get me wrong, there are certainly good things in this movie, unironically. Like, as much as I'm not the biggest fan of the characterization of Mark Webb's Spider-Man, I do think that performance-wise, Andrew Garfield does a pretty damn good job. Some of his quips are on point, the emotion of sadness he sells when Gwen dies is really damn good, and overall he really does just give it his all. Andrew is pretty damn good in this series. I also like that scene where he protects that one kid from a bunch of bullies and even helps him fix his science project. Like, that was a cute little moment. I like that scene. Also, the action is visually really spectacular. Like the final battle with Electro. It's a pretty cool action scene. The other performances, aside from DeHaan, are also pretty good for the most part. Like, Emma Stone does a great job as Gwen Stacy, Sally Field is decent as Aunt May, and even Jamie Foxx, while his character of Electro was crap, Jamie Foxx did a fine job playing him. Even if he had some crummy dialogue at times, for the most part, he was okay. Not to mention, Hans Zimmer's score is very good, especially the theme for Electro. It's actually pretty badass, and I actually would like for them to bring it back for No Way Home. And I'll also admit that I actually like the design of the Rhino mech suit. I like that it looks like a Transformer. It just looks cool to me. And you know what? I'll just confess it. Spider-Man's suit in this movie is admittedly my second favorite Spider-Man movie suit. Alongside the classic Sam Raimi web suit, it's easily one of the best Spider-Man costumes ever made. And I'm actually pretty happy that this is the suit that Andrew will likely be wearing in No Way Home if he does appear. But despite all that positive stuff I just said, I still hate this movie for everything else. It's just a soulless attempt to start a Spider-Man universe with flat villains, a romance that is all over the place, focuses so much on Peter Parker's parents who don't matter, ruins what makes the origins of Spider-Man so interesting, has moments of unintentional hilarity, and overall it's just a huge waste of 2.5 hours. And it actually hurts that a few of the best scenes in the movie are deleted scenes. Like the scene where Peter's dad actually shows up and meets him at Gwen's grave. Had that scene been in the movie, it actually would have justified the whole parents' plotline in a way that was good. Like hell, the acting in the scene itself is amazing, especially from Andrew. He fucking killed it in this scene. But they took it out of the movie, so there goes any relevance you could have given to all of that parental filler. Honestly, this movie is the only Spider-Man movie I actually full-on hate. And in all honesty, it makes me feel bad for Andrew Garfield. He clearly loved playing Spider-Man, and I do actually believe he had some serious potential to be the next best Spidey. But the scripts they gave him were just the worst. 3 out of 10. The Amazing Spider-Man. Okay, I know it seems pretty harsh to rank both Amazing Spider-Man movies very low on my list, but that's because I just happen to have more issues with this duology than I do with Tom Holland's Spidey films. But don't worry, I'm actually not going to hate on TASM 1 nearly as much, because unlike its sequel, it's not a bad movie. I mean, I don't particularly like it that much, but for every aspect of it I don't like, I'm also not afraid to admit that it does have its fair share of redeeming qualities. Like the relationship between Peter and Gwen, which is pretty good. And yeah, it was surely helped by the fact that Andrew and Emma were actually dating as they filmed this. And their chemistry is pretty good. Like, they actually do really give off that couple's energy pretty well. Also, the action sequences are actually really damn good. Like, unironically, this film actually has some pretty good fight scenes. Like the final battle at Oscorp Tower and the fight at the sewer. Those scenes aren't too bad. My favorite fight in the whole movie was definitely the fight at the school. That entire scene was really good, with little moments like Peter going, uh-oh, when Lizard started using a piece of locker that got whipped to his hand as a weapon. That was pretty funny. Or Kurt mixing up some chemicals and using it as a grenade, since he's a scientist. Or when Pete crawls all over him and wraps him up in a web just like a real spider wrapping up its prey. Like, that was just really fucking cool. That entire scene was just great. Also, if there is anything at all that I will confess that these movies actually did do better than both the MCU movies and even the Raimi films, was Flash Thompson, played by Chris Zylka. I mean, as much as we all love the Raimi movies, I'm sure even some of us hardcore fans of that trilogy can admit that Joe Manganiello's Flash is mostly just one of those predictable, cocky, douchey, jock bro bullies that you can find at any movie from that time. And Tony Revolori in the MCU films is just one of those bullies that always picks fights that he can't win, and that just makes him really lame to me. But Chris Zylka's Flash actually feels more like a character than the other two Flashes combined. In fact, I'd actually argue that his character development in this movie was better than Peter's. Like, he starts off as a douchey bully at first, and even has a moment like in the Maguire film where Peter humiliates him with his powers, but later on, they actually have him be the first one to console Peter at school after Uncle Ben's murder. And it's a genuinely really nice bully befriending moment between the two. It also helps that the next time they meet at the end, it's an actually friendly interaction where Peter compliments his Spidey shirt. Like, this movie just does a really damn good job at still having Flash be a bully, but also humanizing him more. So much so that I can actually imagine this Flash becoming Agent Venom. A lot more than this child, that's for sure. And also, hot take here, believe it or not, I actually like the Lizard as a villain. And I argue he's the best antagonist of these two movies. A lot of people call him a bad villain because they say his whole big plan to turn New York into lizard people like him is stupid and makes no sense. But me, I think I understood it enough. Like, they were establishing that Curt Connor's whole goal was just to rid the world of weakness. And his biggest idea to do that was to give people abilities to regrow limbs like a lizard. Much like how his origins went in the comics. And when he used the serum on himself, that then regrew his arm and turned him into the lizard monster, I also got the impression that, like in the comics, the lizard DNA was also messing with his brain. And it gave him the misguided idea that the best way to fully accomplish his goal was, of course, to do to everyone what he did to himself. So it wasn't just some big evil scheme. Like, he wasn't doing it for the fun of it. It was just his sick and twisted way of trying to help people that he thought would be the best option, but really he was just delusional because of the lizard chemicals. And that's why I feel like the Lizard is nowhere near as bad a villain as people say he is. He was a scientist who wanted to help people, but influenced by his own experiments, chose a really unethical way to do so. And I think they portrayed that pretty well for the most part. It especially helps that Rhys Ifans gave a fantastic performance as Curt Connors. I wish his performance was talked about more because it's actually pretty amazing. Like, the raw emotion he puts into playing both Curtis and the Lizard is really great, and it's honestly one of the most underrated villain performances I've seen in a movie. And I'm actually glad he's coming back for No Way Home, as it'll be pretty interesting to see him interacting with Doc Ock and Norman Osborn, since all three of them are scientists. And the score by the late James Horner is definitely really great too. Mostly the main theme. You know, the whole da 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 da, like that's really damn good. But of course, there are also a lot of things about this film I really don't like. And that includes Andrew Garfield's version of the character of Spider-Man. Because despite Andrew giving a pretty solid performance, the way they characterize this version of Peter is just really baffling to me. Like, for every actually good scene he has, where he actually feels like a Spider-Man, like a hero, he also has many moments that make him out to be such an asshole. Like that scene where he's fucking with the carjacker. There isn't even any purpose to that scene other than to just have a moment with Spidey quipping a lot as he messes with this guy. And I would forgive it if it was at least funny, but I don't find it funny because it just doesn't feel like Spider-Man to me. because he acts like such a dickhead as he webs this guy up. Like, I know he's a criminal, but is that any excuse for him to act like a jackass? Not to me. And it gets even worse when a cop then shows up, and when Peter throws his gun away, he's like, really? I just did your job for you, and that's how you thank me? Like, what? That is not something Spider-Man would say to a police officer. Like, that's just uncalled for. And it's not just moments like that. It's also how they recontextualize his origin that I actually kind of hate. They still stick to the whole thing where he got bit by a spider and Uncle Ben gets wasted, but it's the new motivation that they give him that makes me really hate this new origin story. Whereas usually Peter Parker's motivation for becoming Spider-Man is because, it's right. With great power comes great responsibility. There's a hero inside all of us. But in this movie, he becomes Spider-Man out of revenge and goes on a hunt for Uncle Ben's killer. And I really don't like that. Spider-Man's not a hero driven by vengeance. He's a hero who just wants to do the right thing. He's not Batman. Why do they do this? I mean, I'm all for changing a hero's origins and making a more interesting version of them, but nothing about this new origin feels interesting at all. It just feels wrong to me. And he never catches the guy anyway, so what gives? And another thing, why the fuck does he go against Captain Stacy's wish for him to not date Gwen in order to keep her safe? It actually seemed like he was going to take the risk and go for it at first, but then when he sees her again at school, he decides that he's just going to break the promise. Why? Just because Aunt May was like, ooh, you two should fuck. She has no clue what's going on between you two. Come on, Peter. Had you just done what George wanted you to do, maybe Gwen would still be alive. Yeah, overall, Andrew's interpretation of Spider-Man, while I don't hate him necessarily, he does have a fair amount of times where he actually does feel like a good Spider-Man. Like that scene where he saved that kid on the bridge. That was a really good scene. But for the most part, his version of Spidey is just all over the place, as he actually flips between being a good hero and being an amateur jackass whom J. Jonah Jameson's rants on would actually be totally rational. And it's reasons like that that are why I'm more excited for Tobey's appearance than his. Not to mention, the suit he wears in this movie is ass. It's horrible, especially the yellow eyes. They just don't work. Everything about the suit is just wrong. I especially hate how the texture looks like a basketball. It's hideous. Also, Uncle Ben's death in this film is just stupid. He's walking downtown looking for Peter after their argument, and then he notices the guy robbing the store whom Peter let go just bumping into people, and as soon as Uncle Ben sees that he has a gun, he tries to wrestle him for it. Why would you do that? It's not even made clear if he understands that this guy just robbed a store. He just noticed him running pretty frantically, and a gun just fell out of his pocket. I mean, yeah, maybe that would have been a sign that this guy did something wrong, but for all you know, this guy could have just been running, and he also just happened to have had a gun. And it's what makes this easily the dumbest Uncle Ben death out of all the movies. I am dead serious. But anyways, while The Amazing Spider-Man is not an amazing movie, it's also not terrible. Of course, there are good things about it. The action is great, the romance with Peter and Gwen is pretty good, it has good acting, a good musical score, and a decent villain. But again, it has a lot of things that just turn me away from it too. And almost all of those issues mostly have to do with Spider-Man himself. And that's just sad. If you have a Spider-Man movie and most of the issues someone has with it come from Spider-Man himself, then that's a sign that you've done something wrong. I can accept that Andrew Spidey has fans, but I'm just not one of those people. And look, for what it's worth, I'm happy for those who love his version of Spidey that are hyped he's coming back. Much like how I'm a Tobey fan, and I'm really hyped that he's likely coming back. 5 out of 10. Spider-Man: Homecoming. Now, I didn't see this movie in theaters when it first came out because the trailers just made it look really bad. Mostly because they made it very apparent that for the first MCU Spider-Man movie, they were going for the vibe of a high school comedy. A PG-13 superhero version of 21 Jump Street. And when I realized that from the trailers, that really turned me away because I never imagined a Spider-Man story like that. And that just didn't really feel right to me. That's the same feeling you'd get if they made a Superman movie that was mostly set in a Daily Planet and it was an Office Space inspired movie, but with superheroes. That would be pretty off-putting, wouldn't it? It also didn't help that a lot of the humor in the trailers wasn't funny. In fact, some of it was pretty cringe. So I didn't see the movie until sometime after its time in theaters was done and it was finally out on streaming or DVD or something. And you know what? I need to admit that looking back, that was kind of a petty choice of me. because to be fair, it actually wasn't anywhere near as bad as I was worried it would be. In fact, it was actually pretty okay. I mean, there are still things about it I don't like that much, but for the most part, I actually found myself enjoying it far more than both Amazing Spider-Man movies combined. And one of the reasons I say that is because of Tom Holland as Peter Parker. I thought he did a fine job playing Spidey for the first time in Civil War, but in my opinion, he got progressively better and better in each movie he was in. And Homecoming was definitely the first example of that, because he actually does do a pretty damn good job. He plays the role of a more innocent, more tech-based, less experienced, less strong, but still confident Spider-Man very well, and it actually made me appreciate his version of the character more. My favorite scene with him was definitely when he was trapped under all that debris before the final battle, where he's crying and begging for someone to come help, but then gains enough of the courage to lift the debris into the air. And that scene not only shows how strong he actually is, but it also acknowledges the fact that this Peter is technically still a kid with natural fears and doubts that kids often go through as they grow up. And I really appreciated that Jon Watts decided to display that here. Like, that entire scene was incredible. I also really like the way they portray Tony Stark as a mentor to Peter. You really do get the sense that Tony genuinely cares about Peter while being strict as he tries to keep Peter out of trouble in regards to dealing with Vulture's crew, and it really works. Like, the occasional banter and conflict between them is handled very well, and it makes for a really good teacher-student dynamic, which definitely made it sad for both of them when they died in Infinity War and Endgame. Also, the action for the most part is pretty good. My favorite fight in the whole movie was definitely the final fight between Lizard and Spidey on Coney Island after the plane crash, with Vulture letting out that incredibly cold, "Hey Pedro," and just beating the shit out of Peter, and then with Peter saving him from the explosion on his wings. Like, that was a really good fight scene, especially with the nice setting of all the flaming debris around them. And that also leads me to what is easily my favorite part of this whole movie, and that is, of course, Michael Keaton as Adrian Toomes, aka the Vulture. Because in my opinion, he stole the show. Not only is he incredibly charismatic, but he's also intelligent and threatening. Like in the scene where he drives Peter and Liz to the homecoming dance, and Liz points out how weird it is that whenever Spider-Man shows up, Peter isn't there, and Adrian, listening into it, also cleverly pieces it together and realizes that Peter is Spider-Man. And that's why he was so shocked when he showed up to their house. And it actually gets pretty intense when he then threatens Peter to leave him and his crew alone. And he's even holding a gun in his hand in the scene, ready to kill him right there. Like, seriously, this movie turned Vulture from a laughable villain in the comics to an intimidating badass on the big screen, and it was helped tremendously by Michael Keaton's fantastic performance. He was amazing in the role. But of course, there are also some things that I don't like about this movie, and that includes the romance between Peter and Liz. I mean, to be fair, it's not the worst, but nothing about it is interesting to me at all. To me, it's just incredibly bland, and they barely have any chemistry. The only thing I like about it is the reveal that Liz is actually Adrian's daughter, because it makes a more personal conflict between Peter and the Vulture. But I just never found myself caring about their relationship as a whole, and that's why I'm fine with the movie having them split up at the end, so Far From Home could give us a much better romance with him and Michelle. Also, while the action is good for the most part, there was actually one fight in the movie that I actually genuinely hated. And it's the fight on the Stark cargo jet before the Coney Island scene. And this scene, it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. It just looks pretty ugly. Some of the movements of the CG animated Peter and Vulture look kind of unnatural. They almost look like Pixar characters for a couple of seconds, and overall, it is just easily the worst fight of the movie. And let me just say, I do think it is kind of funny how both the best and worst fight of the movie both happen together in the final act. Like, how do you manage to pull that off? Also, kind of like what I expected from the trailers, a lot of the humor in the movie just doesn't work. Some of it was pretty cringeworthy, and other times it was just pathetically predictable, like a moth to the flame. Although, to be fair, not all of it was bad, because there were actually some funny jokes. Like when Peter's interrogating Aaron Davis with a voice modulator, that was pretty funny. Or Vulture's reaction when he killed the first Shocker when he meant to shoot him with an anti-gravity gun. Or even, yeah, Aunt May's reaction to Peter in the suit at the very end. That actually was hilarious. But for the most part, the humor in this film was pretty weak, and I really wish they toned some of it down a little bit. Also, I didn't care much for Ned Leeds in this movie. He's not a bad character. In fact, I will admit, I do kind of like him more in Far From Home. But in this movie, he's mostly just one of those comedic sidekick characters who makes a bunch of quips that aren't as funny as they could be. Like, I already heard that porn joke in Fright Night. I'm not going to find it funnier when a kid uses it as a cover-up for him trying to help Spider-Man track down a supervillain. But for the most part, I'd say Homecoming is okay. It has some great performances by Tom Holland, Robert Downey Jr., and Michael Keaton, has some good action, a good musical score by Michael Giacchino, the Vulture is a great villain, and overall, it was a decent start to the MCU Spider-Man trilogy, which I'm sure is going to end with an absolute bang in No Way Home. 6 out of 10. Spider-Man 3. Now, to tell you the truth, Spider-Man 3 was actually the very first Spider-Man movie I saw in theaters. Like when I was around 6 years old. My dad took me to see it because he knew I was a big fan of Spider-Man and the movies. And the first time I saw it, I loved it. But over time, as I got older, I have come to see that it really isn't a perfect movie. In fact, nowadays, I do agree with the opinion that it really is the weakest film of the Sam Raimi original trilogy. But I still don't think it's a bad movie at all. In fact, I still like it very much. Like, the performances by the main cast are still really good. James Franco is still very good as Harry Osborn. Kirsten Dunst is still good as Mary Jane. Rosemary Harris is great as Aunt May. And of course, Tobey Maguire, the OG GOAT himself, is fantastic in this movie. In all three of the movies, Tobey was always brilliant when playing Peter Parker / Spider-Man. Like, hell, he is Spider-Man, as far as I'm concerned, and 3 was no exception. He was great in this film. Also, just like in all 3 movies of the trilogy, the action sequences are amazing. Every scene from the first fight with Harry as New Goblin, to the fight with Sandman and the subways as he wears the symbiote suit, to the final battle with Harry, Peter, Sandman, and Venom. Like, just in general, the action of this movie is fantastic. The subway fight with Sandman was definitely my favorite. Like, had Flint not been given sand powers, when his head gets lodged into the train, blood would have been everywhere. Seriously. That was brutal, and it definitely gave you the sense that Peter really wanted to kill Flynn in that moment for killing Ben. Yeah, of course, I know he's being influenced by the symbiote, but still, damn. And speaking of Sandman, yeah, I think he's a great villain. Mostly because unlike Doc Ock or Goblin, or even Peter in the same movie, Flint Marko wasn't being influenced by any kind of evil presence created from an awry experiment. He knew he was doing bad things, but felt like it was worth doing if it meant getting a cure for his daughter's cancer. And I think Sam Raimi did a great job at displaying that. So much so that I actually don't hate the retcon with him being the one actually responsible for killing Uncle Ben. Yeah, on paper it does seem kind of stupid, but I think the way it was executed in the movie was fine. And I think it made a very well done personal rivalry between him and Peter, which gets resolved in a really great scene at the end where he confesses and explains that Ben's death was just a horrible accident, and how it then makes Peter acknowledge that even he has done terrible things in his life, and then forgives Flint. For real, Sandman is just a great villain with good sympathetic development and was played brilliantly by Thomas Hayden Church. And yeah, I'm definitely excited to see him return in No Way Home, but I'm also curious to see what kind of role he'll play in the movie. Like, will they acknowledge his arc, or will it, I don't know, imply that he was like taken from the moment Peter almost killed him in the sewers, which would help explain why he wants to kill Spider-Man again without ruining that arc? Who knows? We'll have to wait and see. Also, the score by Christopher Young is great. It's absolutely amazing, especially since it actually feels like a Danny Elfman score, and how it just fits so well alongside Danny Elfman's score from the first 2 movies. In fact, for the longest time, I always thought that it was still Danny Elfman, and only found out that it was a different composer when someone told me it was. Like, that's how good Young's score is. Every piece of music in the film is perfect, from the Sandman theme to the Black Suit theme to the Birth of Sandman theme. Like, all around, the score is just brilliant, and it's just as good as Elfman's score. So much so that, again, it fooled me into thinking that it was Elfman. It's that good. And also, I don't hate the emo Peter scenes, aka Bully Maguire. Yeah, it is kind of cringy, but it's cringy in a funny way. You know, seeing Peter with that emo haircut, walking down the street, finger gunning random chicks, and dancing while it's not even like he's listening to music. Drive That Funky Soul is just playing over the scene. Like, at least have him wear a Walkman in the scene. That way it would help make it make a little more sense. Like, yeah, it's pretty weird, but it's also addicting, and that's what makes it pretty funny to me. I also like the part where MJ throws a rock at Venom to help Pete. That's the most she's helped in these movies as she's in peril. At least she finally did something. I definitely cried at Harry's death. That was a very sad moment. And also, how could I ignore J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson? He's great in all these movies. Like, J.K., he is J. Jonah Jameson, if you ask me. He embodies the character better than anyone else. His mannerisms and all of his line delivery is just brilliantly hilarious. That's why he's always brought back to play the character in tons of the Spider-Man cartoons that came after these movies. And that's most certainly why the MCU brought him back to play their J. Jonah. It's just one of those casting choices you can't see anyone else doing.
And also, it has my favorite Stan Lee cameo. Not where he gives a funny little line, but rather just a touching little moment between a character and his creator. And yeah, one person definitely did make a difference. And that was you, Stan. Rest in peace.
But honestly, even though I do like the movie, I'm not afraid to admit that I do have my problems with it. Starting with Eddie Brock / Venom, played by Topher Grace. And it's not even because of Topher's performance, because it really wasn't his fault, but rather it's because of how they just crammed the character into the movie. Like, producer Avi Arad insisted that Sam include Venom into the movie because, I don't know, just cuz, I guess? And while Sam did try to have all the villain storylines fit together in a fluent way, in regards to Venom, it just ended up failing miserably. Like, Eddie just appears in the first act of the movie, and after Pete as Spidey kisses Gwen at his Key to the City ceremony, who Eddie claimed to have been dating, but really they hung out like once, so he's a fucking liar. And then after Spidey breaks his camera as he tries to take a picture of him, like, after those two inconveniences to him, he then gets the petty idea to ruin Spidey's image with a fake headline. And then after he's caught and fired, he goes to church to ask God to kill Peter. Like, dude, you cannot ask God to kill someone because they rightfully caught you and outed you for actively lying to the public. As an atheist myself, I'm pretty sure that any noble Christian would tell you that that is not how the Lord works. And while I don't hate the design of him as Venom with the symbiote, I do think it just pales in comparison to how he looks in the comics. Like, in the comics, he just looks cooler. I will admit that one thing I do like about Raimi's Venom is the way he's defeated, where Peter realizes the symbiote is sensitive to sound and makes a ton of sound with the metal pulse to weaken it. Like, that was just a really clever way to defeat Venom, and I really appreciate that Sam Raimi went to the effort to research Venom's weaknesses, even though he made it clear how he doesn't like the character. But apart from that, Venom was just totally wasted in this movie, and he was easily the worst villain of the Raimi-verse, which is why I actually prefer the current Tom Hardy version of the character. Even though Raimi's version of the character's origin is far more accurate, at least in terms of how Eddie got the symbiote, and even though I don't even like the Venom movie that much, I still think Tom's version is much better of a character than Grace's version.
So much so that I actually do have the Marvel Legends Sony Venom figure in my collection, which, if you ask me, is a good figure, and I do recommend you get it if you can find it. Also, Gwen Stacy really has no business being in this movie at all. The only reason they put her in the film was just to create some tension between Peter and MJ, but it was just incredibly unnecessary. I guess it would have been fine if it were just like a cameo of sorts, but the fact that they had her be a temporary secondary girlfriend to Peter for a while in this movie is just really lousy. Also, I agree that it is pretty stupid how they just have Harry's butler Bernard randomly tell Harry how he's sure that Norman killed himself, and how they had that be how Harry finds out Peter didn't kill Norman, which then prompts him to help Peter in the final battle. Like, come on, that was just a really lazy way to just have them become allies again in the end. I feel like that if anything, it would have been better if he joined Peter not because he finds out he didn't kill his dad, but rather if there was something else that prompted him to do it. Now, what that would be, admittingly, I don't know. But any option on that table would have definitely been better than Bernard just randomly telling Harry this information he has kept to himself for a few years. And this last thing is kind of a small thing and isn't that big of an issue, but it's just something I never understood, and that is, how the hell does Eddie or the symbiote know about Penny? The only way Eddie would know about this in order to use it to gain Sandman's trust would be if Peter knew about Flint's family beforehand, and the symbiote would tell this to Eddie, since symbiotes can share memories of their hosts. But Peter never knew about Flint's daughter, so how did Venom know about Penny at all? That just never made any sense to me. But by the end of it, despite those issues, I like Spider-Man 3. While it's definitely in a way the worst installment of the OG trilogy, that's often the case with a lot of third installments of franchises, I still think it's a good movie that gets a lot of hate that I feel like it doesn't deserve. because for every not so great thing this movie has, it makes up for it with some excellent performances, some fantastic action scenes, a brilliant soundtrack, some good humor, and a well done story about revenge and forgiveness. And while I do wish we did get Spider-Man 4, part of me is also fine with knowing that these movies ended as a trilogy, since this film did give off enough finality for this trilogy to feel like a full story. I mean, I think we can all agree that it's better that it ended at 3 films as a trilogy rather than it ending at 2 and them never continuing after that, right? 7 out of 10. Spider-Man: Far From Home. Now, unlike Homecoming, I actually did see this one in theaters when it came out. And the reason I decided to see it in theaters was because of the fact that Homecoming wasn't anywhere near as bad as I expected. And also because the trailers for it were actually pretty good. Mostly because, unlike the Homecoming trailers, they didn't make the whole thing look like it was just going to be a high school comedy in vein of Ferris Bueller. So logically, because of all of that, I decided to give it a chance in theaters. And after I saw the movie, I left the theater pleasantly surprised, because Far From Home ended up being far better than I expected. I mean, yeah, I expected it to be better than Homecoming, but I just didn't think it was going to be as good as it ended up being. And I think that was mostly thanks to how this movie further shows Tom Holland's potential as the MCU's Spider-Man. In fact, this was the movie that made Tom Holland my second favorite live-action Spider-Man next to Tobey Maguire. Like, the film just does a really great job at showing Tom's Peter becoming an even better Spider-Man than he was in Homecoming. And part of the reason I say that is because of his amazing arc in this movie of learning to trust his senses and surroundings, building his confidence and figuring out his identity and sense of self. And the scene that I feel really brilliantly displays that is his final confrontation against Mysterio at the end of the movie, where Quentin uses his illusion tech to create a black void around Peter, and Peter, focusing entirely on his Spidey sense, charges towards Beck and obliterates every drone in sight. Like, let me tell you right now, when I saw this scene for the first time, my jaw was on the floor. This entire sequence was hands down my favorite scene with Tom Holland's Spider-Man. Not only because of the visuals and the choreography of the sequence, but mainly because it's the first Spider-Man movie action sequence where instead of his webs, Peter uses his Spidey sense and strength to win the fight. And it perfectly showed how Tom's version of Spidey becomes much more independent and strong-willed. For real, Peter's development in this movie was perfect, and it made me love Tom Holland's version of the character so much more. Especially to a point where I would actually absolutely love to see an interaction between him and Tobey Maguire's Spidey, which may very well happen pretty soon in December. This film also gives us a great villain in the form of Quentin Beck, aka Mysterio, played by Jake Gyllenhaal. Now, I'll be completely honest, I liked Vulture more as a villain, but Mysterio in this movie was also a very well-developed antagonist. The film so perfectly depicts him as the deceptive, gaslighting, cocky, manipulative, and sometimes genuinely intimidating illusionist he is. And yeah, we all knew he was a villain before the movie came out, since he was always a villain in the comics. Like, he was literally one of the first villains that made up the original Sinister Six. So the twist of him being revealed as a fraud and that he had been faking the elemental attacks wasn't surprising. But even though the twist was expected, I think we still gotta hand it to how well done the reveal scene was in the pub. Like, the way they revealed the twist in that scene was just great, as I'm sure it definitely shocked those who didn't know Mysterio was a villain before seeing the movie. And of course, the way they adapt his illusion abilities is fantastic! Most notably the sequence where he puts Peter through a variety of illusions, and it's just an absolute mind-tripping experience. In fact, alongside the final fight, this was easily one of the best scenes of the whole movie, as Quentin gaslights the hell out of Peter and puts him through an utter hellhole of nightmarish illusions. From Peter being attacked by copies of himself, to seeing Mysterio dropping MJ, being entrapped in a snow globe, and of course the scariest part of this entire sequence where he encounters a zombie Iron Man. Like, that shit was actually pretty scary. I got chills when I saw that in the theater. But yeah, Mysterio is a great villain in this film, and he was brought to life perfectly by Jake Gyllenhaal. And I also really like how, unlike any of the other villains in Spider-Man movies, when he knew Peter's identity as Spider-Man, he actually had the nerve to out him to the public. Like, that was actually insane. And I do look forward to seeing the aftermath of all that in No Way Home, as I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting plot point. This movie also improves on a lot of things I didn't like much about Homecoming. like the romance angle of the story. Because whereas I didn't care at all about the relationship between Peter and Liz, I definitely cared far more about the relationship between Peter and Michelle in this film, because they actually have some really great chemistry together. We get some nice little moments where Peter tries to muster up enough courage to ask her out and even give her this black dahlia necklace he buys her on their trip, and also just some wholesome little moments where they try to be charming towards one another, and it's actually pretty cute. Like for real, both Tom Holland and Zendaya do a great job at playing this sweet little couple, and I'm really glad that we're actually going to get more of it in the next film. Another thing this movie does much better than Homecoming was the humor, because it actually is much funnier this time. I actually found myself laughing quite a bit when I first saw it. Like the "how does Cap do that" line from Happy, that was actually pretty hilarious. Or that part where Peter accidentally knocks out Flash on the bus, that bit always cracks me up. Or when Happy mentions an embarrassing time when Peter tried to rent an adult film that was really awkwardly funny. But you get the idea. For the most part, the jokes in this movie were much funnier than in Homecoming. I also like that part where Happy very emotionally watches Peter create his new suit because it clearly gives him memories of Tony. That was a very touching moment. And yeah, it was also amazing that they brought back J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson in the post-credit scene, which was the first time in 12 years since he last played the character in live action, and I'm very happy No Way Home is going to give him a somewhat bigger role. Pretty much the only issues I have are that there are still some jokes that don't work very well. Like the moment where that Brad kid catches Peter undressing in front of the S.H.I.E.L.D. lady and takes a picture of them, like that part just really made me cringe. Or the running joke with Ned and Betty Brant dating throughout the movie, which mostly just consists of them being all, "Hey babe, come here babe, aw babe," and it's just meaningless to me. I mean, I guess it's kind of cute a little bit, but it's just played off as a joke, so like, who cares that much? I also always found it pretty stupid when Peter breaks the lock on the cell door to escape the prison he's in and just leaves the door wide open. Yes, I know it's not a big major plot point and it's just done as a little joke, and the inmates that were in there with him were polite enough to keep the door shut, and sure, what else was he supposed to do to get out? But still, like, come on, Peter, that's a jail cell. Like, for all you know, those guys probably weren't as nice as they seemed to you, and they could have used that as an opportunity to escape. Like, maybe at least just find a way to lock it back before leaving. And this last thing is also another issue I had with Homecoming, and it's also not a major important problem, but I'm not a fan of the style of the end credits. It's too similar to the style of the end credits of Step Brothers, and it just feels out of place for a Spider-Man movie. It's not something that angers me at all, but I just don't think it fits Spider-Man, and I hope No Way Home ditches it for something a little bit more epic. But overall, yeah, Far From Home is actually a really good Spider-Man movie. It improves on some of the problems I had with Homecoming, it sets up an interesting story for the sequel, and made me fully appreciate Tom Holland's Spidey even more than before. And if Jon Watts is able to do a great job with Spider-Man, which will surely be proven further in December, then I can't wait to see what he does with the Fantastic Four. 8 out of 10.
If I were a wealthy man.
Now what can I say about Spider-Man 2 that hasn't already been said by tons of people? I mean, I guess it would be something bad, but what bad things do I have to say about it? None. Like, there's a reason that this movie is still considered one of the top best superhero movies ever made. Because it's just such a really fucking good movie. Everything about it is just brilliant, including how it perfectly captures the duality of the character of Spider-Man, the struggle of Peter Parker and how he deals with the burden of it. Whether he's saving lives as Spider-Man, he's mostly being late for work, or missing a date with MJ and vice versa. Like, he's constantly being beaten by life, and you truly get a great understanding of how hard it really is for Peter, but also very excellently shows how he ultimately pulls through in the end. And Tobey Maguire especially does a great job at selling that through his performance. Not to mention, every single one of the action sequences in these movies are incredible. Like, the fight scenes in the Raimiverse were always so visceral and brutal, and the choreography was always excellent. And 2 is most certainly no exception. In fact, it's easily some of the best action I've ever seen in a superhero movie of all time. And I'd say the biggest example of that was easily the fight on the train between Spidey and Doc Ock. That entire sequence is still amazing to this very day, with seamless choreography, heart-pounding music, and memorable dialogue throughout. Like, it's just all around a marvelous action sequence. And watching it always reminds me why Sam Raimi was basically one of the top 5 kings of superhero movies. Also, of course, Danny Elfman's music, as always, is great. It's easily some of the best music ever composed, not only for a superhero movie, but for any film in general. Every single bit of music in this entire soundtrack is just so captivatingly perfect. From the main theme to Appreciation, which plays during the scene where the train passengers help Spidey after he saves them, and just helps make that whole moment so much more beautiful. And especially the theme for Dr. Octopus, which is just so villainously majestic and intense. And seriously, if they don't bring it back for No Way Home, I will be incredibly disappointed. And speaking of Doc Ock, of course, how could I talk about Spider-Man 2 and not bring him up? Because not only is he one of the greatest superhero movie villains of all time, he's also one of the greatest movie villains in general. Not only because Alfred Molina is absolutely fantastic in the role, but also because of the arc he has as a villain in this movie. He starts off as a caring scientist who had a lot of confidence and then becomes a broken man who lost his wife, and his latest experiments end up influencing him to do terrible things in order to complete his work. And it just makes him a very intimidating and threatening antagonist. But it also gives a perfect and emotional end to his story where Peter, by saying to him the same words Aunt May told him about sometimes we have to let our dreams go in order to do what's right, gets through enough to Otto for him to regain control over the arms, and in a final effort makes the ultimate sacrifice and drowns the fusion reactor into the river to save the city. And it just makes for a very beautiful villain redemption arc. Honestly, one of the best since Vader's turn in Return of the Jedi. For real, Otto Octavius is a perfect villain, and I absolutely cannot wait to see his triumphant return in No Way Home and what type of role he'll play. But anyways, yeah, I fucking love Spider-Man 2. It's one of the greatest superhero movies ever made. It has stellar performances by Tobey, Alfred, J.K. Simmons, Kirsten Dunst, James Franco, and Rosemary Harris. Wonderful action sequences, a brilliant soundtrack by Elfman, and also has some really iconic moments, from the horror hospital scene, to Peter saving the little girl from the fire, to Peter stopping the train, etc. Like, all around, it's just an amazing movie. It was always a childhood favorite of mine, along with the original film, and even to this very day, I absolutely love it. And I especially think it's the perfect film to watch when you're having a pizza party. 10 out of 10. Okay, let me get one thing straight. Again, I love Spider-Man 2 very, very much, as well as the first movie. Both of them are two of my childhood movies, and they're excellent. But I'm not afraid to admit, I love Spider-Man 1 even more. I mean, sure, we all love Spider-Man 2, particularly because of how it shows the struggles of being Spider-Man. But Spider-Man 1 is brilliant as just a simple origin story about how Peter becomes Spider-Man. They portray Peter discovering his new abilities and how Uncle Ben's murder motivates him to become Spider-Man in a way that is so simple but still so perfect. And I'll say it once again, Tobey Maguire is fantastic in this trilogy, and that's especially the case in this film, as he plays Peter becoming Spider-Man so perfectly. And to this day, he is still my favorite Spider-Man, and if he does appear in No Way Home, I might actually cry tears of joy. Also, yeah, the romance between him and Mary Jane is very good. While it sucks that MJ kinda actually does do him dirty in the next two movies, they still have some good chemistry in the series, which was mostly the case in this film because it is very sweet. Most notably the iconic upside down kiss. Like, that's easily the most romantic scene of the entire trilogy, no question. Also, yeah, of course, Danny Elfman. His score for the first movie is still, to this very day, groundbreaking. With music pieces like Revenge, which plays at Uncle Ben's death, Green Goblin's theme, which, just like Doc Ock's theme, I really hope they bring back in No Way Home, and of course, the main theme itself, Tobey Spider-Man's theme. It is the most iconic of all the Spider-Man movie themes. It is just so triumphant and epic, and it just makes you want to swing across the city like Spider-Man. Like, I remember when I was young and I would watch the old films on TV, and to pass the time as I waited for the opening credits to end, I would just jump around my room like Spider-Man to the theme as it played during the credits. It's that marvelous. But I also cannot go on without talking about how much I love Willem Dafoe as Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin, who is honestly my favorite Spider-Man movie villain, and is also one of my top 5 favorite movie villains of all time. Now don't get me wrong, Dr. Octopus, he's a fantastic villain too. But for the longest time, I always liked the Green Goblin just as much, if not even more. And I think the reason that is because whereas Otto was a more paranoid and tragic villain, Green Goblin is more maniacal, wrathful, and homicidal. And yeah, there is somewhat of a sympathetic angle to him as Norman, where he's clearly in conflict with his other personality as the Goblin, but for the most part, you can basically just summarize the Green Goblin as a deranged maniac in a monster mask who just wants to ensue chaos. And I think that's why he's such a great villain. He doesn't have any real big reason for wanting to kill everyone in New York, he's just a murderous lunatic. In fact, I've heard some people compare him to Heath Ledger's Joker from The Dark Knight, and they actually are kinda similar in a few ways. They're both completely insane, they both have tons of deadly weapons, they both give wrong yet pretty interesting speeches about how the people of the city aren't worth saving, and they both love to cause destruction everywhere in their path. Yeah, in a few ways they are kinda similar. I don't think Sam's Goblin inspired Chris Nolan to make the Joker like that in his film, but it is an interesting comparison. But yeah, Green Goblin is hands down my favorite villain of the whole trilogy, as well as one of my all-time favorite movie villains. He's a badass, the whole Jekyll and Hyde thing they do with his dissociative personality is very well done, Willem Dafoe's laugh is perfect, his design is also iconic, I don't care that it's not accurate to the comics, the suit is awesome, especially the mask. And not to mention, he's scary. He's terrifying. He's the scariest villain of all these movies. I remember being terrified by him as a kid. And he's easily the villain I am the most excited to see return in No Way Home, as I'm sure he is gonna be the biggest challenge Tom Speeder will ever face. Like, if this is the same guy who once beat the shit out of Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man in a scene that was incredibly hard to watch, I can only imagine what kind of hell he's gonna put Tom through. So yeah, alongside its sequel, Spider-Man is easily one of my top favorite superhero movies of all time. It's an exciting, nostalgic, heartfelt experience with great acting from Tobey, Willem, Kirsten, Franco, Harris, as well as the late Cliff Robertson. Some of the best action you'll ever find in a superhero movie, was the first thing to ever give us J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson, a perfect musical score, a fantastic antagonist, and overall, it's just a brilliant superhero flick. It has a very special place in my heart, and I cannot wait to see if No Way Home can bring back some of those childhood feelings to the big screen. 10 out of 10! So yeah, that was my personal ranking of the live-action Spider-Man movies. I understand not everybody will agree with me on everything I said in this video, and that's okay. It's cool to think differently. But one thing I should say that I'm sure all of us can agree on is that No Way Home will most surely be the Spider-Man film to officially unite fans of Tobey, Tom, and Andrew once and for all. Like seriously, that film is most certainly going to be the biggest Spider-Man celebration ever put to the big screen. In fact, potentially, it might even actually end up being the new best Spider-Man movie. Like, I'm not afraid to admit that that might actually be a possibility. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed the video. How do you rank the Spidey movies? Who is your favorite Spider-Man? Let me know in the comments. And as always, I will see you next time, and... Holy crap, this was a long video to make.